Don't play with it, don't be dishonest. Ay, still not understanding.
Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are doing the human ear. So we'll start by drawing it. I think you can pause and play the video as we draw the ear together. So now that we're done drawing the ear, I'm going to use dashed lines to separate the outer ear from the middle ear and the inner ear. Just draw a straight line going downwards for the 3 parts. Then we are going to label each part as the outer ear. Then the middle ear. And the inner ear. Now that that is done, we are labeling the parts of the ear. Starting with the outer ear, we have the pinna, which is the outer flap. It traps and directs sound waves towards the second part, which is the auditory canal. So the auditory canal will direct sound waves towards this third part, which is the tympanic membrane. We did mention that the pinna traps and directs sound waves, so just note that down. Using the arrows, we will show the direction of sound waves in the outer ear from the pinna to the auditory canal and then to the tympanic membrane. When the sound waves reach the tympanic membrane, they make it vibrate. So the tympanic membrane will direct vibrations to the middle ear. So we note that down. Just keep it in mind that we have sound waves in the outer ear and sound vibrations in the middle ear. Again, what's happening here is that the tympanic membrane is directing sound vibrations to the middle ear, particularly the ossicles. So our ossicles are going to amplify the vibrations from the tympanic membrane to the first ossicle, then the second one, and the third one. They each have names. That's the malleus, incus, and stapes, or rather you can say the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, depending on how you want to remember them. So the arrows in the middle ear, they represent the direction of sound vibrations from the malleus to the incus and then the stapes. These are transmitting sound vibrations to the oval window. Now when the middle ear is vibrating, there will be a difference in pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane. So the Eustachian tube is going to equalize the pressure. Just note that when you give the function of the Eustachian tube, you write in full, it equalizes pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane. So now our vibrations are moving into the oval window. So So these vibrations, they create pressure waves in the inner ear. This is because there's a fluid in the inner ear. We call it endolymph and perilymph. Just an understanding that when the oval window is vibrating, there will be pressure waves created in the inner ear. We must take note of that. So the direction of sound is now going into this part, which we call the cochlea, and then all the way to the auditory nerve. So labeling the cochlea contains what we call organ of Corti. These are receptors for sound. So the movement created there in the fluid will stimulate the organ of Corti to convert the pressure waves into an impulse, and then the impulse will be sent via the auditory nerve. Still on the direction of sound, it's going through via the auditory nerve to the cerebrum. We know when we did the brain that the cerebrum interprets sensations from all sense organs, which includes the ear. Now let's go backwards. Sound waves are trapped by the pinna and directed to the auditory canal. And the auditory canal will direct sound waves to the tympanic membrane, which is number 3. The tympanic membrane will start to vibrate and then send vibrations to the ossicles. Number 4, which is the ossicles, will amplify vibrations. So each one of the bones will vibrate, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. So they amplify vibrations and direct them to the oval window. So this will create pressure waves in the inner ear, and then the cochlea, inside the cochlea, the organ of Corti will detect this stimulus and convert it into an impulse, which will then be transmitted via the auditory nerve to the cerebrum. So I've numbered them number 1 to number 8 so that it is easier for you to follow through the direction of sound, and we call this hearing. Now the round window, which we have not labeled, what it does is it absorbs excess sound waves or pressure waves. So when there is excess sound waves or pressure waves, they will be absorbed by the round window, and this is to prevent echoing. And this is to prevent echoing. Again, we did say that this is hearing, one of the functions of the ear. Now in the inner ear, we have the semicircular canals, as well as the vestibula, also known as sacculus and utriculus. I prefer the word sacculus and utriculus. These two parts are responsible for balance. So they contain receptors for balance. Starting with the semicircular canals, the receptor for balance that is found there is known as the crista. So the crista will detect change in speed and direction. So whenever there's a change in speed or direction, the crista will be stimulated. In the sacculus and utriculus, on the other hand, we have the macula, which is the receptor for balance when there is a change in position of the head. So to round that up, the crista detects change in speed and direction, and then the macula will detect change in position of the head. they are both responsible for maintaining balance, this impulse from the receptors will be transmitted via the auditory nerve. However, in this case, it is going to the cerebellum. So the direction of the nerve impulse from these two parts will go, as indicated by the orange lines, to the cerebellum. It says the diagram below shows part of the human ear. Our focus will just be on the human ear, which is part A, B, C, D, and J. Since we're only focusing on the ear, we'll skip these other questions and go to 3.1.3. As Miss Candice Ndlovu walked into a hall with the wet floor without knowing, she heard a loud voice from a lady, "It's wet," and she slipped and almost fell. From the statement, the sound will be hearing, and then sleeping and almost falling will then be balance. So the first question, describe the role of part B in maintaining balance in Miss Candice Ndlovu. So part B is the ampulla, which will then relate to the semicircular canals and the fact that it contains receptors called crista that maintain balance. So in your answer, you should mention that part B contains crista, so they detect or are stimulated by the change in speed and direction, and then they convert it into an impulse. So this is a 3-mark question, so we can end here because we are asked to describe the role rather than explain. So the 3 marks will go to containing crista, the change in speed and direction, and conversion of stimulus into an impulse. The next question, it says describe the role of part A to C in enabling her to hear. So we just describe the movement of sound from A to C. A, which is the tympanic membrane, will vibrate and transmit vibrations to the ossicles, and then the ossicles will vibrate and amplify vibrations, transmit them to the oval window, and then the oval window will create pressure waves in the inner ear, or in the endolymph, or the fluid in the inner ear. The organ of Corti, which is found in the cochlea, will convert that stimulus into an impulse. It's the same, we end here because we're just describing from part A to part C. Let's look at a different question. It says the diagram below shows parts of the human ear. We have parts A, B, C, D, and E. I'm going to give you a moment. You can pause this video and label these parts. Now that the parts are labeled, we can go to the first question. It says identify part C, which we have labeled as the auditory nerve. The next question, you give letter and name. It's a 2-mark question, 1 for the letter, 1 for the name. The part that absorbs excess pressure waves, that's part B, the round window. So 1 mark for the letter and 1 mark for the name. Next is the part that contains crista and maculae. It should be part E. That is the semicircular canal. Now the last question, you state the function of part A and D. So part A is the oval window. What it does is it transmits vibrations from the middle ear to the inner ear to create pressure waves in the inner ear, particularly sending them to the cochlea. Last question, part D. That is, the cochlea, it will contain receptors for sound, which we call the organ of Corti, which convert stimulus into an impulse. With this question, I will first let you label all the parts. I think we're going to use this question just to discuss some parts that we did not mention earlier. So you can pause and label. So now all the parts that I mentioned are labeled. We can see that the pinna and the auditory canal are not labeled in the diagram. Let us separate our outer ear from the middle ear as well as the inner ear. We know that the sound waves in the outer ear, sound vibrations in the middle ear, and pressure waves in the inner ear. So the part of the ear that has fluid is the inner ear, which is why it creates pressure waves. The outer ear and the middle ear don't have fluids, so it is important for the middle ear to not have any fluid, because if it does, then we call that middle ear infections, which are caused by fluid build-up when maybe a pathogen enters through the eustachian tube. So what happens is a grommet will be placed in front of the tympanic membrane to drain the fluid from the middle ear. Something else that could happen is if the bones in the middle ear, they harden. So the tissue of the bones hardens, and it means that vibrations cannot be amplified. So no vibrations means no pressure created in the inner ear, and therefore no stimulus will be converted into an impulse, which means that no impulse is sent to the cerebrum for interpretation, and therefore hearing loss will result. Note that these are issues in the middle ear. Now with the cochlea, on the other hand, issues with the cochlea would be if the organ of Corti is not converting stimulus into an impulse. This would mean that no impulse will be transmitted via the auditory nerve to the cerebrum, and therefore no hearing, which can result into deafness. However, if this is the issue, a cochlear implant can be implanted into the inner ear so that it does that job. While with hardening of bone tissue, a person can put on what we call a hearing aid, which will then amplify the vibrations. Meanwhile, the cochlear implants just does the job of the organ of Corti, which will be to convert sound stimulus into an impulse. Now let's look at the questions on this particular diagram. 141, it says identify part B. We've identified that as the semicircular canals. And then part E is the round window. The next question, you give the letter and the name of the part, the 2-mark question, the part that is filled with A. That will be part D. This is because the other parts don't have A inside of them, and that's the eustachian tube. The next question contains organ of Corti, and that's clear, it's the cochlea, part C. Next question, you just give the letter where the grommets are inserted, and that is part F, and the one that amplifies vibration is part A. We'll end the video here. Goodbye.